Assalamualaikum friends. Welcome back to Chemistry Unlocked. In today's lecture, we'll be wrapping up atoms, elements and compounds and then diving into the periodic table. Let's try to cover as much as possible. To begin, let's quickly review what we covered in our first lecture, which you can find on the channel. The proton number, also called the atomic number, is the smaller number written with an element. ये छोटा वाला नंबर होता है जो कि एलिमेंट के साथ लिखा हुआ. Mass number is the bigger number written with an element. ये हमारे पास बड़ा वाला नंबर होता है जो कि एलिमेंट के साथ लिखा हुआ. It tells us the total number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus. How do we calculate mass number? मास नंबर को हम लोग कैसे कैलकुलेट करें? We calculate mass number by adding the number of protons with the number of neutrons. Let's take the example of carbon 12 to understand this better. We calculate the mass number by adding the 6 protons of carbon 12 and 6 neutrons. So we get mass number 12. Now let's move on to more examples. The first example that we have of mass number is the oxygen 16 that has 8 protons and 8 neutrons. So how do we calculate it? We calculate it by adding up protons with the neutrons. Mass number equals to 8 plus 8 equals to 16. Sodium 23 on the other hand has 11 protons and 12 neutrons. Mass number equals to 11 plus 12 equals to 23. Number of neutrons. Okay, oxygen 16 has mass number 16 and atomic number 8. Number of neutrons equals to 16 minus 8 equals to 8. How do we calculate it? We calculate it by subtracting the smaller number, which is the proton number, from the bigger number, which is the mass number. हम लोग छोटे वाला जो नंबर एलिमेंट के साथ लिखा हुआ होता है उसको माइनस कर देते हैं बड़े वाले नंबर में से जो कि मास नंबर होता है. Okay, now let's move on to the second example. Sodium 23 has mass number 23 and atomic number 11. Number of neutrons equals to 23 minus 11. So the answer comes out to be 12. Now let's move on to ions. An ion is a charge formed when an atom gains or loses electrons. To explain this, there is an example of a symbol Y that has 8 protons. In a neutral atom, the charge equals to 0 because the proton number equals to the electron number. So the charge equals to 0 because positive and negative are equal on both sides, as you can see on the screen. Now let's move on to anions, the negative ion. Add 1 or 2 electrons. As we add 1 or 2 electrons, there are more electrons on the right hand side than the protons on the left hand side. So therefore the charge increases of electrons. As you can see in the first one, there are 9 electrons and 8 protons. So there is one more electron. So therefore the charge equals to minus 1. Now let's move on to the second one. There are 10 electrons and 8 protons. So there are 2 more electrons than protons. So the charge equals to minus 2. More electrons than protons equals to anions. हमारे पास anion कब बनते हैं जब electrons ज़्यादा हों protons से. Okay. Now let's move forward to cation, which is the positive ion. We remove 1 or 2 electrons. Now as you can see, there are more protons than electrons in this. There are 8 protons and 7 electrons in the first example. So therefore the charge equals to plus 1 because there is one more proton than electron, or you can say fewer electrons than protons. Okay. And in the second example, there are 2 more protons than electrons, so the charge is plus 2. Now let's move on to isotopes. What are isotopes? Isotopes are atoms of same element having same number of protons but different number of neutrons. As you can see, carbon 12, carbon 13 and carbon 14. These are all the same elements. Now let's move on to their proton numbers. They have the same number of protons, 666. Now let's move on to their different number of neutrons. It has all of them have different number of neutrons because of different number of mass number, which is the bigger number. And how do we calculate neutrons? We calculate neutrons by subtracting protons from the mass number. So therefore the neutrons are different. Chemical properties depend upon number of electrons in outermost shell. Because these electrons take part in chemical reaction. केमिकल रिएक्शन में हमारे पास दे टेक पार्ट इलेक्ट्रॉन्स जो होते हैं केमिकल रिएक्शन में इन्वॉल्व होते हैं. बॉन्डिंग इन्वॉल्व्स इलेक्ट्रॉन्स इन द आउटर मोस्ट शेल. अच्छा जी, बॉन्डिंग हमारे पास टू टाइप्स की होती है, या तो शेयरिंग होगी या फिर ट्रांसफर होगा. तो आउटर मोस्ट शेल के जो होते हैं वही होते हैं ट्रांसफर या फिर शेयर. Now let's move on to isotopes. Isotopes are chemically identical because they have same number of electrons in their outermost shell. Isotopes chemically identical होते हैं क्योंकि same number of electrons होते हैं उनके last shell में. As you can see, protons are 666, so therefore the electrons are also 666. Unstable atoms release radiation. This is called radioactivity. Just learn this one thing. You don't need to get into the depth of this. You will learn this in physics. Now let's move on to the electronic configuration or arrangement. It shows the number of electrons in each energy level of an atom. As you can see on the right hand side that there are number of shells. This is the first shell, this is the second shell, and this is the third shell. So then these are the electrons. ये हमारे पास electrons होते हैं shells में. Examples में हमारे पास सबसे पहली important चीज़ जो होती है, the first important thing is कि in the first shell there are 2 electrons, and in the second shell 8 electrons, third shell 8 electrons. For first 20 elements यही होता है हमारे पास. Okay, and the second thing is one shell must be full before electrons start filling the next shell. हमारे पास एक शेल पूरा completely fill होना चाहिए, फिर next shells पे हम लोग मूव करते हैं. Like first shell में 2 हो गए, then we move on to the second shell, उसमें 8 हो गए, then we move on to the third shell, उसमें भी 8 हो गए, तो फिर हमारे पास तरह मूव होता रहता है आगे. हमारे पास कुछ एग्जाम्पल्स हैं. This is the first example of the symbol X that has 8 electrons. Okay, 2 6. हमारे पास first shell में 2 electrons and there are 2 electrons in the first shell. So the remaining 6 are in the second shell. Now let's move on to the second one, X20. There are 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, and 8 electrons in the third shell. So 2 electrons remain. So they move into the fourth shell. Now let's move on to the third one, aluminium 13. 3 plus equals to 28 because it loses 3 electrons. Aluminum loses 3 electrons. So therefore in the first shell it has 2 electrons, and in the second shell it has 8 electrons. Now let's move on to chlorine, 17 electrons. It gains one electron. It gains 1 electron. In the first shell it has 2 electrons. In the second shell it has 8 electrons. In the third shell it has 8 electrons. So it becomes fully stable. Now let's move ahead on to the periodic table. Now let's start with the periodic table. As you can see on your screen, this is the periodic table. Let's move ahead. Elements are arranged in the periodic table based on the increasing number of protons. Okay, as you can see, the proton number increases and elements are arranged on the basis of increase in number of protons. जैसे जैसे number of protons increase हो रहे हैं, elements भी change हो रहे हैं हमारे पास, और उसी की basis पे हमारे पास arranged है. Relative atomic mass. It is the average mass of all naturally occurring isotopes of an element compared to 1/12 of the mass of a carbon 12 atom. What does it tell? This is the definition. The examiner may ask this in the paper. Now, what does it tell? The relative atomic mass tells us how heavy one atom of an element is compared to this standard. Okay. The abundance of isotopes influences the relative atomic mass. Now let's move on to the examples. The first example is of chlorine, that has the mass 35 and the relative percentage 75%. And then chlorine 37, that has mass number 37 and 25% is the relative percentage. How do we calculate the mass number? How do we calculate the relative atomic mass? We calculate the relative atomic mass by multiplying the mass number with the percentage abundance. As you can see, this chlorine 35 has mass number 35, so we multiplied it with the relative percentage, which is 75, and then we added it with the second isotope that has 37 mass number and has 25 percentage relative percentage. 37 into 25, we added both of them and then divided it by 100. So the answer comes out to be 35.5. Now let's move on to the second example of boron. B10 equals to 20%. B11 equals to 80%. How do we calculate relative atomic mass? We calculate it by multiplying the mass number with the percentage abundance. 10 into 20 plus 11 into 80 divided by 100. So the answer comes out to be 10.8. Now let's move on to the third example of magnesium. Magnesium 24 has relative percentage of 79%. Magnesium 25 has relative percentage of 10%. Magnesium 26 has relative percentage of 11%. How do we calculate relative atomic mass? We calculate it by multiplying the mass number with the relative percentage of a relative abundance percentage. Okay, 24 into 79. Then we added it with the second one, 25 into 10. Then the third one, 26 into 11. Then we divided them all up with 100. Then the answer comes out to be 24.3. Now let's move on to the arrangement. Left to right is the period and it tells us the number of occupied shells. As you can see on your screen, this is called period. Left to right, as we move from left to right. This is the first period, this is the second period, this is the third period, this is the fourth period, this is the fifth period, this is the sixth period, this is the seventh period. So there are 7 periods. Now let's move, it tells us the number of occupied shells. Okay. As you can see, hydrogen has 1 electron and it is in period 1. So it occupies 1 shell. Now let's move on to lithium. Lithium has 3 electrons. Sorry, lithium has 3 electrons. So, and it is in period 2. So it occupies 2 shells. 2 electrons in the first shell and 1 electron in the second shell. Let's move on to potassium now. Potassium has 19 electrons and it is in group 4. It occupies 4 shells because it is in period 4. 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, and 8 electrons in the third shell, and 1 remaining electron in the last shell. Now let's move to the second thing. Top to bottom is called group. Top to bottom is called group. It tells us the number of electrons in the outermost shell. Okay. This is called group. This is group 1. It has charge plus 1. This is group 2. It has charge plus 2. These are the transition elements. This is group 3. It has charge plus 3. This is group 4. It has charge plus 4. It has charge plus 4 or minus 4. This is group 5. It has charge minus 3. This is group 6. It has charge minus 2. This is group 7. It has charge minus 1. And noble gases have no charge. Group 8 has no charge. It tells us the number of electrons in the outermost shell. The group number tells us the number of electrons in the outermost shell. As you can see, lithium is in group 1 of the periodic table. So it has 1 electron in the outermost shell, 2 electrons in the first shell, and 1 electron in the second shell. Now let's move on to calcium. Calcium is in group 2 of the periodic table. Calcium must have 2 electrons in the outermost shell, 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, and 8 electrons in the third shell. So 2 electrons remain. 2 electrons are in the fourth shell. Okay. Now let's move on to aluminium. One more example. Aluminum is in group 3 of the periodic table. So it has 3 electrons in the outermost shell, 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, 3 electrons remain. So there are 3 electrons in the outermost shell. Now let's move ahead onto the group 1 elements. Group 1 elements are also called alkali metals. These are the alkali metals. Okay. Group 1 metals are soft. They can be cut with a knife, which is unusual for metals. ये knife से cut किए जा सकते हैं. Soft metals होते हैं group 1 के. Now third point, highly reactive metals, therefore stored in oil because they react quickly with air and water. Why do we store them in oil? Because they are highly reactive. So to prevent them from reacting with moisture or oxygen in the air, we store them in oil. हम उनको oil में store करते हैं ताकि वो react ना करें moisture और air से. They have 1 electron in the outermost shell, as we discussed that they form plus 1 ions. They have plus 1 charge, so they form plus 1 ion. They lose 1 electron to become stable. They have 1 electron in the outermost shell. To become stable, they lose that electron. They are also good conductors of electricity because they have free moving electrons. They conduct electricity well because they have free moving electrons. इनके पास free moving electrons होते हैं. Reactivity increases down the group, as you can see on the right. Reactivity increases down the group. Sodium is more reactive than lithium. Potassium is more reactive than sodium. Okay, as the outermost electron is getting further away from the nucleus, which means the force of attraction is getting weaker and the outer electron is easier to displace. As we discussed, the period increases down the group, so the number of occupied shells also increases. As you can see, this is the first shell, this is the second shell. So as we move downwards, the number of occupied shells increases and the force of attraction between an electron and the nucleus decreases. So therefore the electron can be displaced easily. हमारे पास देखें आप लोग राइट हैंड साइड पे इलेक्ट्रॉन्स दूर हो गए हैं अब न्यूक्लियस से, तो फोर्स ऑफ अट्रैक्शन न्यूक्लियस एंड इलेक्ट्रॉन की वीक हो गई है. सो हमारे पास ये इजीली गायब हो सकते हैं इलेक्ट्रॉन, यहाँ से लॉस हो सकता है. द मेल्टिंग पॉइंट डिक्रीजेस डाउन द ग्रुप. ओके, रिएक्टिविटी का इजीली आप लोग कर सकते हैं याद. वो कुछ होते हैं बच्चे जो कि मेल्टिंग पॉइंट नहीं याद कर पाते, तो उनके लिए बस रिएक्टिविटी का अपोजिट होता है. एज रिएक्टिविटी इंक्रीजेस डाउन द ग्रुप, मेल्टिंग पॉइंट डिक्रीजेस डाउन द ग्रुप. नाउ लेट्स मूव फॉरवर्ड. All metals react with water to form metal hydroxide and hydrogen gas. Always remember, whenever a metal reacts with water, it forms metal hydroxide and hydrogen gas. As you can see, sodium reacts with water. It forms two products, sodium hydroxide, and a hydrogen gas is released. What are the observations when group 1 metals react with water? It floats on the surface of the water. The metal floats on the surface of the water. Surface पे float करता हुआ आप लोगों को नजर आएगा metal. Second है fizzing. H2 gas is released. Fizzing होती है हमारे पास due to the release of hydrogen gas. हमारे पास जब भी हाइड्रोजन गैस रिलीज होती है तो फिजिंग होती है. ओके, वायलेंट फास्ट रिएक्शन होता है भाई. एज वी मूव डाउन द ग्रुप द रिएक्शन इज मोर विगरस. क्यों भाई? हमारे पास इलेक्ट्रॉन्स इजीली लॉस हो सकते हैं, तो वायलेंट फास्ट रिएक्शन होता है ग्रुप 1 मेटल्स में. ओके जी. नाउ लेट्स मूव ऑन टू वैलेंसी और द ऑक्सीडेशन स्टेट. It is the number of electrons an atom needs to lose, gain or share to become stable. To become stable, atom needs to lose, gain or share something, right? So it shares, loses or gains electrons. अब स्टेबिलिटी का हमें कैसे पता लगता है? स्टेबिलिटी का हमें पता लगता है जब आउटर मोस्ट शेल कंप्लीट हो जाए. ओके, फॉर एग्जांपल सोडियम loses one electron. It is in group 1, so it has one electron in the outermost shell as we discussed. It has proton number 11, so electrons भी 11 होंगे. So electronic configuration हम लोग देख लेते हैं. 2 in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, and 1 electron in the third shell. So it is not stable. So therefore it loses 1 electron to become Na+. Na+ बन जाता है ये एक इलेक्ट्रॉन लूज करके. Now it becomes stable with a full outer shell. 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell. So the stability, the atom becomes stable because complete हो गया outermost shell. The outermost shell complete हो गया. Now let's move ahead on to the potassium. Potassium loses 1 electron. It is also in group 1 of the periodic table, so it loses 1 electron. Proton number is 19, so electrons are 19. Electronic configuration is 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, 8 electrons in the third shell, and 1 electron in the fourth shell. So therefore to become stable it needs to lose something, right? So it loses 1 electron to become K+. Now it becomes stable with a full outer shell. 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, and 8 electrons in the third shell. आप लोगों के पास देखें कंप्लीट हो गया outer most shell. इसने लूज किया 1 इलेक्ट्रॉन और अब ये कंप्लीट हो गया outer most shell. Now let's move on to the group 2 elements. Group 2 elements को alkaline earth metals ही बोला जाता है. Each atom has 2 electrons in its outer shell. As we discussed, groups define करते हैं हमारे पास number of electrons in the outermost shell. So therefore in group 2 atoms have 2 electrons in its outermost shell. They form +2 ions. Charge +2 का होता है इन पे. Loses 2 electrons to become stable. Stable होने के लिए ये 2 electrons lose करते हैं जो कि outermost shell में होते हैं. All are metallic and good conductors of heat and electricity. Metallic भी होते हैं and good conductor of heat and electricity भी होते हैं as due to free movement of electrons. Okay. Harder and denser than group 1 metals. Harder और denser होते हैं ये group 1 metals. Less reactive than group 1 but still reactive. अच्छा जी, less reactive क्यों है? Reactivity is lower because group 2 elements have to lose 2 electrons to become stable, which requires more energy than losing just 1 electron in group 1 metals. इससे क्या मतलब हुआ भाई? इससे मतलब ये हुआ कि रिएक्टिविटी इसलिए लोअर है हमारे पास क्योंकि ग्रुप 2 के एलिमेंट्स को 2 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स लूज करने पड़ते हैं, तो उसकी लूज करने के लिए भी उनको एनर्जी चाहिए होगी ना, तो वो एनर्जी जो रिक्वायर करते हैं उसकी वजह से वो रिएक्टिविटी उनकी कम रहती है. जबकि ग्रुप 1 में हमारे पास सिर्फ एक इलेक्ट्रॉन लूज करना होता है, तो उसमें हमारे पास इतनी ज़्यादा एनर्जी की रिक्वायरमेंट नहीं होती. इसमें हमारे पास रिएक्टिविटी इंक्रीजेस डाउन द ग्रुप. बिल्कुल ग्रुप 1 की तरह रिएक्टिविटी इंक्रीजेस डाउन द ग्रुप. ओके, now let's move on to this. React slowly with cold water to form metal hydroxide and hydrogen gas. अच्छा जी, हम as we discussed earlier कि whenever a metal reacts with water, it forms two products, metal hydroxide and hydrogen gas is released. Okay, as you can see, calcium reacts with water to form two products, calcium hydroxide plus hydrogen gas is released. Now let's move on to the oxidation state. Magnesium. Magnesium is in group 2 of the periodic table. Therefore, it has 2 electrons in its outermost shell. So, to become stable, it loses 2 electrons. It has proton number 12. So, electrons are also 12. Electrons भी हमारे पास 12 होंगे. Now, let's move on to the electronic configuration of this. 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell and 2 electrons in the third shell. So it is not stable. ये stable नहीं है ना हमारे पास 2 electrons हैं तो stable नहीं है. So therefore it loses 2 electrons to become Mg2 plus. Now it becomes stable with a full outer shell, 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell. 2 electrons इसने lose किए to become stable. ये stable हो गया. अब देखें हमारे पास 8 electrons हो गए outermost shell में stable हो गया. Now let's move on to the second example, calcium. Calcium loses 2 electrons. Proton number is 20, so electrons are 20. Electronic configuration. What is the electronic configuration of calcium? 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell and 8 electrons in the third shell. And 2 electrons remain, so they are in the fourth shell. It is not stable. ये अभी stable नहीं है हमारे पास, क्योंकि हमारे पास लास्ट शेल में जो आउटर मोस्ट शेल है हमारे पास, वो हमारे पास स्टेबल नहीं है, फुल नहीं है वो, तो स्टेबिलिटी हमारे पास नहीं है. लूजेस 2 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स टू बिकम कैल्शियम 2 प्लस. अब ये लूज भी तो करेगा ना, 2 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स इसको लूज भी करने पड़ेंगे. इसने 2 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स लूज किए. नाउ इट बिकम्स स्टेबल विद अ फुल आउटर शेल 288. Now we'll be discussing group 3, also called the boron group. Elements like boron and aluminum have 3 outer electrons and form 3 plus ions to become stable. अच्छा जी, ये हमारे पास group 3 में है, boron and aluminum. So therefore group 3 elements have 3 electrons in their outermost shell. So therefore to become stable they have to lose them, right? वो lose करेंगे तभी तो stable होंगे. 3 electrons को जब outer shell के lose करेंगे तभी stable होंगे. एंड हमारे को पता है कि चार्ज क्या होता है उन पे, 3 प्लस का चार्ज होता है, 3 प्लस. ओके जी. बोरॉन इज अ मेटलॉइड नाउ एंड फॉर्म कोवेलेंट कंपाउंड्स. ये हमारे पास कोवेलेंट कंपाउंड्स बनाता है. अब नाउ व्हाट इज मेटलॉइड्स? Metalloids, it is an element that has properties of both metals and non-metals. Metalloid वो होता है जिसके पास प्रॉपर्टी हो दोनों की, metals की भी and non-metals की भी. While aluminum is a metal and forms ionic compounds. Aluminum हमारे पास metal है तो ionic compound बनाता है. ओके जी. Now let's move on to the oxidation state. Boron is the first example. Boron loses 3 electrons. प्रोटॉन नंबर बोरॉन का क्या है भाई? प्रोटॉन नंबर बोरॉन का है 5. और electrons, there are 5 electrons. So electronic configuration is 2 electrons in the first shell, 3 electrons in the second shell. Now you guys tell, is it easier to gain 5 electrons to have 8 electrons to become stable in the outermost shell, or is it easier to lose 3 electrons to become stable? It is easier to lose 3 electrons ना. So ये हमारे पास 3 electrons lose कर देता है to become stable. It loses 3 electrons to become B3 plus, stable with full outer charge 2. अब हमारे पास full outer shell 2 हो जाता है हमारे पास, तो हमारे पास outer shell full हो गया. Aluminum loses 3 electrons. Group 3 में 3 electrons in its outermost shell, therefore it loses 3 electrons. Always remember. Proton number is 13, so there are 13 electrons. What is the electronic configuration now? Electronic configuration is 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, and 3 electrons in the third shell. Now, is it easier to gain 5 electrons or to lose 3 electrons? It is easier to lose 3 electrons. So, it loses 3 electrons to become aluminum 3+. Now, it becomes stable with a full outer shell. 2 electrons in the first shell and 8 electrons in the second shell. ओके, अब तक के लिए हमने जो पढ़ लिया बहुत है. अब हम लोग नेक्स्ट लेक्चर के साथ आपसे मिलूंगा. तब तक के लिए दुआओं में खास याद रखिएगा. अल्लाह हाफिज़.